The night I signed those papers, I barely slept. I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the last few years. Had I missed the signs? Had there been late nights, unexplained absences, or distant stares that I brushed off as nothing? I couldn't find any answers. All I knew was that she was gone, and she wasn't coming back. By mid-morning, I had a plan, or at least the start of one. I wasn't going to wallow in self-pity for 3 months. I couldn't. I needed to stay busy, keep my mind occupied, and avoid the black hole of what-ifs and if-onlys. The first step was selling the house. I didn't want to stay in a place that felt haunted by her absence. Alex Carter, my old high school friend turned real estate agent, agreed to handle everything discreetly. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. Within a week, we had a buyer, a single dad looking for a fresh start, much like me. The second step was liquidating. I sold Marcy's Volvo for pennies on the dollar, cleared out her remaining clothes and belongings, and donated most of the furniture. The house felt hollow, but at least it wasn't suffocating anymore. I spent hours combing through financial records, closing joint accounts, canceling shared credit cards, and opening new ones under my name only. I cashed in life insurance policies I'd forgotten I even had. It was strangely satisfying, like taking back pieces of myself she'd slowly chipped away over the years. In the evenings, I'd pour myself a drink, sit on the back porch, and watch the sun dip below the horizon. It was during those moments, when the world was quiet and still, that the reality of my situation would hit me the hardest. I'd been replaced. Not just by any man, but by someone who represented everything I wasn't: wealth, ambition, status. Nathan Caldwell. His name echoed in my head like an unwelcome guest. A real estate developer with a penthouse view and a sleek black Mercedes. I wondered if he made her feel the way she used to make me feel, like the luckiest man alive. Or was she just another ornament on his polished, high-rise life? But the worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was the fact that I still loved her. Despite everything, despite the lies and the affair, I couldn't just turn off 25 years of love. And that realization felt heavier than anything else. The girls called me every couple of days, checking in, asking questions I didn't have answers to. Emily was calm and logical, trying to understand the situation without letting her emotions get the better of her. Grace, on the other hand, was furious. Furious at her mother, furious at Nathan, furious at me for not fighting harder to keep Marcy from leaving. I didn't tell them much. What was there to say? That their mother had fallen out of love with me. That she'd traded our life for a view of the river and a luxury car. Some truths are better left unsaid. In the quiet of those days, I turned to my hobbies. My coin collection became an obsession. I'd spend hours cataloging, cleaning, and photographing each piece for online sales. Geocaching became my excuse to escape the walls of the empty house. I'd drive for hours, searching for hidden treasures in remote corners of the city, the thrill of discovery offering temporary relief from the dull ache in my chest. One evening, as I sat scrolling through the endless listings on a real estate website, I stumbled across a cabin. It was tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't expensive, but it felt right. A place to start over, to rebuild whatever was left of me. Without hesitation, I made an offer. Within days, it was accepted. I packed what little I had left, a few boxes of clothes, my coin collection, and a bag of camping gear. Everything else, I sold or donated. The house was empty now, ready for its new owner, and I was ready to leave it behind. As I stood in the doorway one last time, I took a deep breath. The air felt heavy with memories, but also with possibility. I wasn't running away, I was walking towards something new. I didn't know what awaited me in that cabin, but it had to be better than standing still in a life that wasn't mine anymore. Alex Carter had managed to dig up more information about Nathan Caldwell and his latest real estate project than I ever could. He had connections, a friend at a local commercial bank who'd cross-referenced details and filled in the gaps. I was itching to hear what he'd uncovered. It had been weeks, and in all that time, I hadn't heard a single word from Marcy. The girls called regularly, checking in on me, but they didn't mention their mother. I could tell they were walking a tightrope, balancing their loyalty to me with their love for her. I didn't hold it against them. She was still their mother, no matter what she'd done. In the meantime, I'd kept myself busy. A few yard sales helped me clear out unnecessary clutter. I left just enough furniture in the house to make it appealing for prospective buyers. Then one Sunday morning, there it was, a photograph of Marcy and Nathan in the society section of the local paper. They were at some charity gala, wine glasses in hand, smiling alongside city officials and local business moguls. She looked radiant, like she didn't have a single regret in the world. A few more weeks passed before Alex came back with an offer on the house. It was low, far below the appraised value, but it came with a quick, no-nonsense closing in 60 days. Perfect timing for me. Along with the offer, Alex had also pieced together a detailed background on Nathan Caldwell. He suggested we meet for lunch to go over it, and I eagerly agreed. But before our meeting, I needed a break. Hayes Mountain had always been one of my favorite places to clear my head. I'd already found all the geocaching there in the past, but I wasn't done exploring. Today, I had a new goal, finding 3 government survey landmarks hidden on the mountain. These markers, often buried or obscured by nature, were used to define property boundaries. They weren't flashy or exciting like treasure chests, but for dedicated geocachers like me, they were a thrill to discover. Armed with my GPS and a metal detector, I set out early in the morning. The Madison Land Trust managed most of Hayes Mountain, nearly 2,000 acres of preserved wilderness constantly under threat from developers. Next to the trust parking lot was a charming orchard and an old farmhouse with a faded "For Sale" sign staked into the ground. On impulse, I wandered over to the fence line and leaned against it, taking in the view. The thought of bulldozers tearing up those apple trees made me feel sick. Thinking of buying it, or just window shopping? The voice startled me, and I turned to see an old man walking toward me. He was wearing faded overalls and a John Deere baseball cap, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He introduced himself as John Turner, the owner of the property. We chatted for a while. He told me he'd been holding out, hoping the land trust would buy the property to preserve it, but they couldn't come up with the $600,000 he was asking for. Developers were circling like vultures, including, unsurprisingly, Nathan Caldwell. John explained how options worked in real estate. Caldwell had already secured agreements on 5 other nearby lots, but this orchard was the linchpin. If he couldn't get it, the entire deal would collapse. "He's banking on me caving in," John said with a shrug. "But I'd rather see these trees standing than another shopping plaza." We shared a laugh, but the weight of his words stayed with me as I walked away. Caldwell's name kept popping up everywhere, and every mention left a bitter taste in my mouth. I hiked up the mountain, following my GPS coordinates to the first 2 landmarks. Both were relatively easy to find, standard metal rods embedded in concrete, stamped with government seals. The third, however, was trickier. The coordinates led me to a patch of forest thick with underbrush and years of fallen leaves. After nearly an hour of searching, I spotted something, an old brick monument partially buried under moss and debris. A tarnished bronze plaque was affixed to it. I took a picture, mentally noting its location to share later. But then, just as I was about to leave, my metal detector let out a faint but persistent beep. Something was buried nearby. Kneeling down, I began to carefully clear away the dirt and leaves. About 10 feet south of the monument, I found it, a small, rusted iron box wrapped in heavy, oil-stained canvas. It was locked tight, but despite the rust, the structure felt solid. I hesitated for a moment. Finds like this on public land were technically supposed to be reported to authorities or historical societies. But standing there, holding that box, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Whatever was inside felt personal, like it was meant to be found by someone who would truly appreciate it. Back home, I cleared off the kitchen table and placed the box in front of me. The lock was old, corroded, and stubborn, but my bolt cutters made short work of it. The lid creaked open, and inside, wrapped carefully in another layer of canvas, were 12 pennies. At first, I felt a pang of disappointment. Pennies? But as I examined them closer, I realized these weren't ordinary coins. They were large cents, the kind minted in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The newest one was from 1814, and the oldest dated all the way back to 1793. Each one was remarkably well preserved, the details sharp and clear despite their age. I remembered an old book my grandfather had left me, The Quirks of the Penny. It was a dense, dusty tome filled with obscure facts and varieties of old coins. I'd never paid it much attention, it had sat untouched on my bookshelf for decades, but tonight, it was going to be my guide. I stayed up until dawn, magnifying glass in hand, cross-referencing every detail of those 12 coins. My scanner hummed softly as it captured high-resolution images of each one. These pennies weren't just old, they were rare, valuable pieces of history. And somehow, they'd been left hidden in the woods, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon them. As the first light of dawn crept through my kitchen window, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a box of coins, it was something more. A mystery. A puzzle. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of excitement about what lay ahead. The details of each coin were etched in my mind. Every nick, scratch, and stamp stood out under the magnifying glass like a tiny map of history. I'd stayed up until dawn, obsessing over their condition, knowing I was holding something extraordinary. When I finally collapsed into bed, it felt like my mind was still spinning. I slept until noon. Around lunchtime, I called work to check in. They mentioned that Phil Williams, one of the company executives, had been asking about me. No details, just curiosity. I didn't dig deeper. My focus was elsewhere. The coins were worth millions, not just because of their age, but because of their condition and rarity. Yet, turning them into cash wasn't going to be easy. The more I researched, the clearer it became. Liquidating assets like these wasn't as simple as walking into a pawn shop or calling a local collector. It was a delicate dance, one misstep, and you could lose everything. Over breakfast at IHOP, flipping through the local paper, my stomach tightened. There they were again, Marcy and Nathan Caldwell. This time, they were at an art gallery opening, dressed to kill. She wore a black cocktail dress, holding a glass of champagne, her arm casually hooked around his. They both smiled at the camera like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at that photo for a long time, the edges of the newspaper crinkling under my fingers. But then, something clicked. A plan started forming in my head, clear and sharp. The first call I made was to John Turner, asking him to hold off on any decisions about the orchard for a few days. He sounded skeptical but agreed. The next stop was the Madison Land Trust office. I asked how to make a meaningful donation, one that could shift the odds in their favor. They were eager to help me figure it out, their voices bright with hope. We were 4 weeks away from the finalization of the divorce. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, that date felt monumental. Like a ticking clock counting down to something important. I spent the rest of that day researching coin dealers and auction houses, skipping over the flashy advertisements and looking for the ones who could handle high-stakes, discrete transactions. Eventually, I landed on Towers Burns in New York City. Their reputation was impeccable. They'd navigated controversial sales before, always emerging with their integrity intact. I set up an appointment for Monday afternoon. Before heading to New York, I called Emily and Grace. I asked them to keep Monday morning free for lunch. I missed them, and honestly, I wanted something to ground me before stepping into what felt like a shark tank. The Towers Burns office was a polished fortress of wealth. Glass walls, gleaming display cases, soft lighting, it felt more like a high-end art gallery than a place of business. The receptionist greeted me by name and led me through a set of glass doors into the less glamorous back offices. James Towers himself met me in a small, unassuming conference room. His picture was plastered all over the company's advertisements, but in person, he looked older, sharper, like a man who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. He greeted me politely and then called in Maurice Cookson, a renowned expert in early copper coins. I recognized his name immediately, he'd authored several guides I'd referenced just days earlier. Like Towers, Maurice looked older than his photos suggested, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. I placed 4 high-resolution photographs of my coins on the table. Each image was crystal clear, showing every detail of both sides. The two men leaned over them, inspecting each one in silence. Maurice adjusted his glasses several times, his brow furrowing slightly. Finally, they exchanged a brief glance, and James leaned back in his chair. When they asked me what I wanted, I didn't hesitate. I wanted $800,000 for the lot, less than they were worth, but with one condition. They had to use $600,000 of it to buy John Turner's orchard and donate it to the Madison Land Trust. The remaining $200,000 would come to me in cash. James and Maurice exchanged another look before stepping aside to confer in low voices. After a few minutes, Maurice left the room, and James returned alone. They agreed to my terms. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. I had a fifth coin, a rare 1793 strawberry leaf cent. Even Maurice seemed genuinely excited about it. Coins like that didn't just appear out of nowhere. They asked how I'd acquired it, and I gave them the same story I'd planned. My grandfather had left it to me. Whether they believed me or not didn't seem to matter. The coin spoke for itself. Before we wrapped up, Maurice handed me a small purple Crown Royal bag. When he spilled its contents onto the table, gold and silver coins clinked softly against each other. There must have been nearly 100 pieces in that bag, some rare, some common, but all valuable. Maurice explained that these were coins the firm couldn't easily sell due to various restrictions. But someone like me, with experience selling coins online, would have no problem finding buyers. I nodded, agreeing to the arrangement. The 4 pennies were handed over to James, and contracts were signed. The deal was done, but we all knew the fifth coin, the strawberry leaf, was the real wild card. Before I left, James offered me a cup of coffee, and I accepted. I had a feeling this wasn't over yet. When he returned, he wasn't alone. A striking woman walked in beside him. Dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that looked like they could see straight through me. She introduced herself as Letitia Rothberg. Her voice was low, controlled, and undeniably confident. She asked me one simple question: did I have a passport? When I said yes, she nodded. Good. Because we were heading to JFK. Apparently, setting up offshore bank accounts wasn't something you did over Zoom. For the first time in months, I felt something other than anger, bitterness, or exhaustion. It was a spark, a sense of momentum, a feeling like I was on the edge of something big. The 1793 strawberry leaf coin was carefully placed in James Tower's hands, and for a brief moment, the man looked like a kid on Christmas morning. He said thank you twice before leaving the room with it, his expression a mix of awe and greed. No price had been discussed yet, but the look on his face told me he was already mentally calculating its worth. I still had 7 more coins tucked away, and Towers made it clear he wanted them. For now, though, he agreed to hold onto the small bag of gold and silver coins Maurice had given me until I returned. An hour later, Letitia and I were already on a plane bound for the Cayman Islands. She barely spoke during the flight, her focus somewhere far away. When we landed, the scene at the airport caught me off guard. Photographers swarmed her, cameras flashing like a strobe light show at a concert. Letitia wore a tight-lipped smile, the kind that masked irritation while still giving the photographers exactly what they wanted. I had no idea who she really was, or why she was attracting this level of attention. Our car was waiting, a bright yellow compact SUV that looked out of place among the sleek luxury vehicles lining the curb. Letitia climbed into the driver's seat without hesitation, pulling her skirt up higher than necessary as she slid behind the wheel. I caught myself sneaking a glance at her tanned legs, and she caught me catching myself. Her smirk said it all. She knew the power she wielded, and she wasn't afraid to use it. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the underground parking lot of a mid-sized condominium complex. Letitia owned the entire building, but she lived exclusively on the penthouse floor. Inside, her apartment was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the turquoise ocean. She offered me a drink. I asked for a beer. She brought one over, and the sight of her walking across the room was as captivating as her earlier exit from the car. Letitia Rothberg wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. She carried herself with a confidence I'd rarely seen in anyone. We moved to the balcony. The view was breathtaking, but the wind was fierce, whipping at our clothes and hair. Letitia leaned casually against the railing, her beer bottle dangling from her fingertips. For a moment, it felt like she was trying to impress me, to show me how far above my league she was. But the truth was, I wasn't easily impressed by glass balconies and designer furniture. I was here for one reason, to secure my future. She asked me if I had any questions, her voice low and steady. I asked her why we needed to fly all the way here to open a bank account. Her answer was short and polished: security, discretion, and simplicity. 1 coin might not seem like much, she said, but 7 coins. 7 coins were enough to turn heads in the wrong circles. We went back inside, away from the wind. She tossed a joke my way about bringing me here to be her sex slave for a few days. I laughed, caught off guard by her bluntness. There was humor in her words, but also something else, a sharp edge, a calculated awareness of her power over me. Letitia was the kind of woman who played chess when everyone else was playing checkers. Dinner was at a quiet seaside restaurant. Fresh lobster, candlelight, and a view of the moonlit waves crashing against the shore. It was perfect, except for the wine. When I pushed my glass aside, she raised an eyebrow. I explained, sheepishly, how cheap white wine had once made me so sick that the smell alone was enough to turn my stomach. She smiled, called over the waiter, and ordered 2 cold beers instead. The conversation flowed more naturally after that. She asked about my life, my daughters, my work, my marriage. I told her about Emily and Grace, how proud I was of them, and how they were both studying finance at Columbia University. She mentioned she was a guest lecturer there and had met them once. The world felt oddly small in that moment. When the topic shifted to my marriage, the words felt heavy coming out of my mouth. I told her about Marcy, about how she'd left me for a wealthy real estate developer with a Mercedes and a penthouse view. I admitted that I'd stayed in my grocery management job because it felt stable, because moving up the corporate ladder would have meant uprooting our family. Marcy never said she was unhappy with that decision, but looking back, maybe she was. Maybe she'd been waiting for an excuse to leave, and Nathan Caldwell had been that excuse. Letitia listened without interrupting, her dark eyes focused on me like she was dissecting every word. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said something that stung. Maybe Marcy had left because I'd spent too much time trying to keep her happy instead of demanding my own happiness. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was hard to argue with. When I finally told her about my job, as a grocery department manager, I felt a flicker of embarrassment. Letitia didn't flinch, didn't smirk. She simply asked if I liked what I did. I told her I did, and that I was good at it. That seemed to be enough for her. Back at the condo, we sat across from each other on the couch. She asked me, point blank, for my first impression of her. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, trying to figure out if she wanted flattery or honesty. In the end, I gave her both. I told her she was beautiful, intelligent, confident, and driven. But I also told her she was manipulative, spoiled, and used her charm to get what she wanted. For a second, I thought I'd crossed a line. But then she smiled, a real smile, not the polished one she gave the photographers at the airport. The ride back to the condo was quiet, but the tension between us had shifted. There was an understanding now, an unspoken acknowledgement that we'd both dropped our guards, if only briefly. That night, as the sound of the ocean drifted in through the open windows, I realized something. Letitia Rothberg wasn't just another wealthy, beautiful woman with a sharp mind and expensive taste. She was a storm, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The 1793 strawberry leaf coin was carefully placed in James Tower's hands, and for a brief moment, the man looked like a kid on Christmas morning. He said thank you twice before leaving the room with it, his expression a mix of awe and greed. No price had been discussed yet, but the look on his face told me he was already mentally calculating its worth. I still had 7 more coins tucked away, and Towers made it clear he wanted them. For now, though, he agreed to hold onto the small bag of gold and silver coins Maurice had given me until I returned. An hour later, Letitia and I were already on a plane bound for the Cayman Islands. She barely spoke during the flight, her focus somewhere far away. When we landed, the scene at the airport caught me off guard. Photographers swarmed her, cameras flashing like a strobe light show at a concert. Letitia wore a tight-lipped smile, the kind that masked irritation while still giving the photographers exactly what they wanted. I had no idea who she really was, or why she was attracting this level of attention. Our car was waiting, a bright yellow compact SUV that looked out of place among the sleek luxury vehicles lining the curb. Letitia climbed into the driver's seat without hesitation, pulling her skirt up higher than necessary as she slid behind the wheel. I caught myself sneaking a glance at her tanned legs, and she caught me catching myself. Her smirk said it all. She knew the power she wielded, and she wasn't afraid to use it. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the underground parking lot of a mid-sized condominium complex. Letitia owned the entire building, but she lived exclusively on the penthouse floor. Inside, her apartment was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the turquoise ocean. She offered me a drink. I asked for a beer. She brought one over, and the sight of her walking across the room was as captivating as her earlier exit from the car. Letitia Rothberg wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. She carried herself with a confidence I'd rarely seen in anyone. We moved to the balcony. The view was breathtaking, but the wind was fierce, whipping at our clothes and hair. Letitia leaned casually against the railing, her beer bottle dangling from her fingertips. For a moment, it felt like she was trying to impress me, to show me how far above my league she was. But the truth was, I wasn't easily impressed by glass balconies and designer furniture. I was here for one reason, to secure my future. She asked me if I had any questions, her voice low and steady. I asked her why we needed to fly all the way here to open a bank account. Her answer was short and polished: security, discretion, and simplicity. 1 coin might not seem like much, she said, but 7 coins. 7 coins were enough to turn heads in the wrong circles. We went back inside, away from the wind. She tossed a joke my way about bringing me here to be her sex slave for a few days. I laughed, caught off guard by her bluntness. There was humor in her words, but also something else, a sharp edge, a calculated awareness of her power over me. Letitia was the kind of woman who played chess when everyone else was playing checkers. Dinner was at a quiet seaside restaurant. Fresh lobster, candlelight, and a view of the moonlit waves crashing against the shore. It was perfect, except for the wine. When I pushed my glass aside, she raised an eyebrow. I explained, sheepishly, how cheap white wine had once made me so sick that the smell alone was enough to turn my stomach. She smiled, called over the waiter, and ordered 2 cold beers instead. The conversation flowed more naturally after that. She asked about my life, my daughters, my work, my marriage. I told her about Emily and Grace, how proud I was of them, and how they were both studying finance at Columbia University. She mentioned she was a guest lecturer there and had met them once. The world felt oddly small in that moment. When the topic shifted to my marriage, the words felt heavy coming out of my mouth. I told her about Marcy, about how she'd left me for a wealthy real estate developer with a Mercedes and a penthouse view. I admitted that I'd stayed in my grocery management job because it felt stable, because moving up the corporate ladder would have meant uprooting our family. Marcy never said she was unhappy with that decision, but looking back, maybe she was. Maybe she'd been waiting for an excuse to leave, and Nathan Caldwell had been that excuse. Letitia listened without interrupting, her dark eyes focused on me like she was dissecting every word. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said something that stung. Maybe Marcy had left because I'd spent too much time trying to keep her happy instead of demanding my own happiness. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was hard to argue with. When I finally told her about my job, as a grocery department manager, I felt a flicker of embarrassment. Letitia didn't flinch, didn't smirk. She simply asked if I liked what I did. I told her I did, and that I was good at it. That seemed to be enough for her. Back at the condo, we sat across from each other on the couch. She asked me, point blank, for my first impression of her. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, trying to figure out if she wanted flattery or honesty. In the end, I gave her both. I told her she was beautiful, intelligent, confident, and driven. But I also told her she was manipulative, spoiled, and used her charm to get what she wanted. For a second, I thought I'd crossed a line. But then she smiled, a real smile, not the polished one she gave the photographers at the airport. The ride back to the condo was quiet, but the tension between us had shifted. There was an understanding now, an unspoken acknowledgement that we'd both dropped our guards, if only briefly. That night, as the sound of the ocean drifted in through the open windows, I realized something. Letitia Rothberg wasn't just another wealthy, beautiful woman with a sharp mind and expensive taste. She was a storm, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I stuffed my personal belongings into my locker at work, wished my team good luck on their shifts, and headed out. My face stiffened as I spotted yet another photo of Marcy and Nathan Caldwell in the paper. This time, they were attending a barbecue fundraiser for a local politician, dressed like a couple straight out of a lifestyle magazine. They looked perfect. A carefully curated image of happiness. I forced myself to look away. Back home, I spent an entire day cataloging the coins from the small bag Maurice Cookson had given me in New York. Each one was photographed, evaluated, and prepared for listing on eBay. It took hours to write the descriptions, set the prices, and prepare the shipping materials. Once the listings were live, the money began flowing into my PayPal account before being quietly transferred to my offshore bank account. By the time I was done, I felt drained, but also strangely accomplished. I had secured my future, piece by piece. Friday lunch with John Turner came and went in an easy rhythm. He was pleased about Nathan being tangled up in his failed land deal but disappointed that I hadn't squeezed more out of the situation for myself. Explaining the complexities would have taken more energy than I had, so I just let him ramble. As we wrapped up, John slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were the deeds to 5 acres of land on the edge of town. He and his wife were retiring to Florida, and this was his way of tying up loose ends. No good deed goes unrewarded, he said with a smile before shaking my hand and walking out of the diner. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Emily and Grace were flying into Nashville and would arrive in 2 hours. Flights to Nashville were cheaper than Huntsville, and the girls were on a tight student budget. I had time to make the drive, and honestly, I was glad for the excuse to get out of the house. The girls spilled out of the terminal, all chatter and excitement. Emily couldn't wait to tell me about their latest class experience. Apparently, Letitia had guest lectured one of their finance courses at Columbia. Right in the middle of a lecture hall packed with 300 students, she'd strolled in like she owned the place. After a brief introduction, she picked 2 students at random for lunch at an upscale hotel. "You'll never believe it, Dad, they picked us." Their faces lit up as they described the lunch. Letitia had asked about their classes, their future plans, and, of course, about me. Emily and Grace exchanged knowing looks before prodding me for answers. "How did you even meet her, Dad?" I couldn't help myself. With a straight face, I said she was looking for a sex slave, and I'd been the lucky pick. Grace rolled her eyes and smacked me lightly on the shoulder. "Be serious, Dad." They pushed me for more details, but I kept it vague. They didn't need to know the whole story, not yet, anyway. Back on the road, conversation drifted into safer territory. The girls asked about my plans to move to New York, about the house sale, and about my new offshore account. They were proud of me, I could tell, but also a little hesitant, like they weren't entirely sure if I was okay. As we crossed the Alabama state line, Grace's phone buzzed. She answered and listened for a moment, her expression shifting from confusion to excitement. She hung up, leaned forward from the back seat, and grinned at me. "Guess what, Dad? Letitia is coming to Huntsville on Tuesday. She said you owe her breakfast in bed." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt a strange mix of flattery and pressure. Letitia didn't strike me as the kind of woman who made empty promises. If she said she'd be here, she'd be here. The weekend with the girls went by in a blur. They spent Saturday afternoon with Marcy, though they didn't meet Nathan. I'd asked them not to bring up Letitia, and they promised to keep that part of the story under wraps. Back at the house, we went through their old belongings, sorting out what they wanted to keep and what could be donated. By the end of the weekend, we had everything boxed up and ready for storage. On the drive back to Nashville, the girls made me promise one thing: don't screw things up with Letitia. Cindy turned to me and said, "Just don't make her mad, Dad. It's simple enough." When I got back home, I sank into my chair with a beer in one hand and the Sunday paper in the other. No photos of Marcy and Nathan this time. Instead, a small story caught my eye: Keystone Development was having financial difficulties with one of their local projects. Winter wheat futures had plummeted, and it seemed Nathan had miscalculated his safety net. I picked up the phone and called Alex Carter. He agreed to come over for a couple of beers so we could talk it through. Nathan Caldwell's financial history was messier than I'd realized. His fortune came in waves, riding high one year, bankrupt the next. He was known for cutting corners, making risky plays, and jumping ship just before things collapsed. The investors who had backed his latest project were already starting to scatter, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing unraveled. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. Monday morning arrived, and the coins I'd listed on eBay exceeded all expectations. Cookson had estimated their value at $300,000, but the auctions were already pushing well past that. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my laptop screen, watching the numbers climb. 3 months ago, the thought of selling antique coins on the internet would have sounded ridiculous. But now, it felt like freedom. The sale of the house went through without a hitch. The buyers finalized their financing, and a check for $200,000 was transferred straight into my offshore account. They even agreed to let me stay in the house for another week, which worked out perfectly. Tuesday morning came, and with it, a phone call. Letitia Rothberg was arriving on Delta Flight 724 at 10:45 a.m. I showed up half an hour early, pacing near the arrivals gate. The photographers arrived before she did, cameras clicking and reporters murmuring. Letitia emerged from the gate like she was walking onto a runway, calm, composed, and utterly unfazed by the chaos around her. She spotted me, smiled faintly, and walked over. On the drive back to my nearly empty house, I couldn't stop thinking about how effortlessly she seemed to handle everything, the cameras, the questions, the attention. Meanwhile, I felt like a fish out of water. We stopped for fast food on the way back, Taco Bell, her choice. It was oddly charming to see a woman like Letitia bite into a burrito without a hint of hesitation. Back at the house, she finally explained her presence. She knew I was moving to New York, and she had a solution. I'd be staying with her, in her spare bedroom. A moving truck was scheduled for the following morning. When I asked how she knew all this, she smirked and said, "That's what I do. Keep my eye on the little things, and the big things take care of themselves." For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long while: hope. Letitia's offer caught me off guard, but it was impossible to find a reason to refuse. Her confidence made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. "Sure," I said. "Let's pack." We spent the afternoon surrounded by boxes, sorting, tossing, and folding. I'd expected her to be out of place, more at home in a boardroom or a high-rise office than in my half-empty house. But she surprised me. Letitia moved with purpose, folding shirts and shaking her head at my outdated wardrobe choices. She wasn't shy about her opinions either. I lost more clothes to her sharp critiques than I'd packed into boxes. When we were done, the stack of boxes barely fit into my car, but it wasn't nearly enough to justify a moving truck. I could only hope she'd ordered something small. As I closed my laptop after checking my last eBay auction, I heard a knock at the door. Outside, a delivery van idled in the driveway. A sharp-dressed courier hopped out, clipboard in hand. "Are you David Simmons?" I nodded. "I have a delivery for you. Where do you want it?" I glanced at the driveway, then back at him. "What delivery?" "It's from Mr. Ramon Duarte." "Is there room in your garage?" I gestured to the empty spot where Marcy's Volvo had once been parked. The courier nodded and waved toward the truck. Letitia had her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with laughter as the truck doors swung open. 5 minutes later, I stood frozen in my garage, staring at an electric orange Lamborghini Gallardo Spider. The sleek curves, the polished chrome, it didn't even look real. Next to my ancient Volvo, it was like parking a spaceship beside a covered wagon. The courier beamed with pride. "Isn't she a beauty? A 2008 Gallardo Spider Superleggera. One of the finest machines ever built." Letitia couldn't contain herself any longer. Her laughter rang out, bright and genuine, as I signed the delivery paperwork. The courier saluted us both and drove off, leaving me with the most absurdly expensive gift I'd ever received. We headed out for ribs at Dreamland Barbecue, the kind of place where you roll up your sleeves and forget about fine dining etiquette. Over beers and a full rack of ribs, I asked her about the car. Ramon invested heavily in winter wheat. Everyone thought he was out of his mind when prices started to plummet. But instead of backing out, he doubled down. In less than a week, he made over $40 million. The money made him happy, but it was the respect he earned that really thrilled him. "Did he mention my name?" I asked cautiously. "No," Letitia said with a smirk. "He wanted to thank you personally, but he knew you wouldn't accept money. So, he sent the car. It's his way of showing gratitude without making you feel indebted." I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head. I'm sending it back in the morning. Letitia smiled knowingly. That's what I figured. But don't worry, Ramon won't be offended. He expected it. We ordered another round of beers. The conversation flowed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Marcy, about the divorce, or about the empty house waiting for me. I was just there, in the moment, enjoying Letitia's company. Later that night, we went back to the house. The air felt charged with unspoken words, lingering glances, and a kind of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. When Letitia reached for my hand and pulled me toward the bedroom, I followed without hesitation. The night was unforgettable. There's no other way to put it. For once, I wasn't overthinking things or second-guessing myself. When the morning light filtered through the curtains, Letitia sat cross-legged on the bed, sipping coffee from a mug and nibbling on a fruit Danish. Breakfast in bed sounds a lot more romantic than it actually is, I said, trying to balance my tray without spilling coffee everywhere. We laughed, and it felt easy. Natural. Afterward, over real breakfast in the kitchen, I finally asked the question that had been circling my mind for days. Why me, Letitia? What do you see in me? I'm not rich, I'm not young, and I don't have much to offer someone like you. Her expression softened as she set down her coffee cup. I've had my fill of slick, charming men who talk big and deliver little. You're not one of them. You're honest, you're grounded, and you're smarter than you let on. I respect that. So, you're saying I'm not a smooth-talking scumbag? I smirked. Exactly, she said with a grin. But then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. I was impressed by what you pulled off with Towers Burns. You played the game well, David. You're not just some grocery store manager, you're a man who knows how to make a move when it matters. I hadn't realized she knew so much about the deal. Apparently, Letitia had been keeping tabs on me from the start. I'm not a fool, David. I had to know who I was dealing with. She was leaving on an early flight back to New York. The thought of saying goodbye felt heavier than I'd expected. Before she left, she handed me a key to her apartment in New York. Just in case, she said. The movers arrived the next morning, loading up the last of my boxes. The Lamborghini dealership called, they'd send someone to pick up the car later that afternoon. I wasn't about to drive a bright orange supercar around town. Alex Carter called with news about Keystone Development. It seemed Nathan Caldwell's empire was beginning to crumble. Investors were pulling out, funding was drying up, and rumors about unpaid debts were swirling. Nathan had miscalculated, and now the walls were closing in. That evening, Marcy showed up at my door. She looked tired, drawn, like she hadn't slept in days. I'm leaving in a few days, but I'll help however I can, I said cautiously. She asked about the orange car in the garage. I explained it was a gift from a grateful investor, a man I'd helped out at a party. The more I spoke, the more her face twisted with confusion and, dare I say it, regret. Eventually, she blurted out the truth. The lease on her fancy riverside apartment had expired, and Nathan hadn't been able to renew it. They were living at a Holiday Inn now, and she wanted to know if she could stay in the house. The house is sold, Marcy. The deal closed yesterday. The new owners are moving in this weekend. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and something else, fear, maybe. She asked about the money from the sale, but I shrugged and told her it was gone. I'd set up my new life, prepared for my move to New York. I drove her back to the Holiday Inn. The ride was quiet, filled with unsaid words and a tension so thick it was suffocating. As she got out of the car, she hesitated for a moment, then walked away without looking back. The week passed quickly. By Thursday, the final divorce papers arrived. On the front page of the local paper was a photo of Letitia arriving at the airport, hand in hand with me. I smiled as I imagined Marcy seeing it over breakfast. As I crossed the Virginia state line, heading north, Emily called. Clayton had skipped town, left Marcy stranded with no money, no car, and a pile of unpaid bills. What should I do, Dad? Emily asked, trying not to laugh. I grinned and said, smile.